I am at Victory Valley College today going through the brain models that we have for anatomy. The brain has three regions. The largest region of the brain is the cerebrum. The cerebrum. We also have the cerebellum. The cerebellum means little brain in Latin. You can see why it might have that name given its appearance. The third major division of the brain is the brainstem. The brainstem is located here. The more superficial portion of the cerebrum that has these convolutions is called the cerebral cortex. You might notice when looking at the brain that we have hills and valleys. The hills are called gyri. Singular would be gyrus. The valleys are sulci, and the singular form for sulci is sulcus. The brain is separated into two hemispheres. Let's get our orientation. The cerebellum is going to sit inferiorly and posteriorly. This would be posterior, anterior, left, and right, making this the left hemisphere, and this would be the right hemisphere. The two hemispheres are separated by a long fissure called the Great Longitudinal Fissure. The Great Longitudinal Fissure. From the lateral view, we see another fissure located here called the Sylvian fissure. The Sylvian fissure is going to separate the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe and parietal lobe. One of the major landmarks that you should know is located in this model at number 4. So this would be the central sulcus. Okay, and it continues and goes down each side. This is the central sulcus. The central sulcus is a landmark that separates the frontal lobe anteriorly from the parietal lobe posteriorly. Here is that central sulcus. So in front of this sulcus, this is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is going to be responsible for attention, reasoning, judgment, problem solving, creativity, regulating one's emotions, controlling one's impulses, and empathy or being aware of how others might feel. Within the frontal lobe, we have the primary motor cortex shown in this model at 15. So this is the primary motor cortex, sometimes called the somatomotor cortex. Also, it has the name of precentral gyrus. So in addition to those cognitive skills, we also have our primary motor cortex located in the frontal lobe. Posterior to the frontal lobe, we have the parietal lobe. The parietal lobes are primarily responsible for receiving and processing sensory input, including touch, pressure, heat, cold, and pain. Part of this is because this is where the primary somatosensory cortex or postcentral gyrus is located. The parietal lobes are also involved in the perception of body awareness, knowing where you are in physical space, and your mental map of where you are, or your internal GPS. So recall that at 4 here, 4 is actually referring to this central sulcus here. And so another name for the somatosensory cortex here is the postcentral gyrus. Okay, the postcentral gyrus. The parietal lobe is going to go from this point to the Sylvian fissure on the side, and in the back to just under 19 here. In this model, number 8 is occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe is going to be posterior to the parietal lobe and will be located here. The occipital lobe has the primary visual cortex. It is responsible for visuospatial processing, distance and depth perception, color determination, and object and face recognition. The temporal lobe is responsible for interpreting sounds from the ears and plays a significant role in recognizing and using language. The temporal lobe also helps with object recognition and interacts with other structures to create new and long-term memories. The cerebellum is located here. The cerebellum translates as little brain. The function of the cerebellum is hand-eye coordination, being able to do things like walk, holding a cell phone, the motor skills required to drive a car and operate a computer, for example. When somebody has issues with their cerebellum, a lot of times their coordination, balance, and sports ability are hindered. In this model, we have the supramarginal gyrus, or SMG, located at number 22. The supramarginal gyrus is activated due to phonics, or sound processing, used in language. Also, verbal working memory tasks are processed here. The supramarginal gyrus. Posterior to this, at number 21, we have the angular gyrus. The angular gyrus is a hub of several networks that are involved in various functions, including attention, self-processing semantic information, emotion regulation, and being able to create a mental picture. It is thought that the angular gyrus plays a role in musical performances. At 17, we have the intraparietal sulcus. The areas within the interparietal sulcus serve as interfaces between perceptive and motor systems for controlling arm and eye movements in space. Here at number 18 in this model, we have the superior parietal lobule. The superior parietal lobule plays roles in motor skills, sensory sensations, working memory, and attention. Structures 11, 12, and 13. 11 is the superior frontal gyrus. 12 is the middle frontal gyrus. And 13 would be the inferior frontal gyrus. The superior frontal gyrus is thought to be important for higher cognitive functions, including working memory. In the left hemisphere, we find that the middle frontal gyrus plays a key role in the development of being literate. This same region on the right hemisphere of the brain is thought to be responsible for numeracy, which is the ability to understand and work with numbers. The right inferior frontal gyrus is associated with various cognitive functions like paying attention, motor inhibition, and imagery, as well as cognitive processing, social cognitive processing, and speech functions. Going back to the temporal lobe here at number 23, we have the superior temporal gyrus. This is involved in auditory processing, including language processing, but also plays a role in social cognition. At number 24, we have the middle temporal gyrus, and at 25, the inferior temporal gyrus. Both the middle and the inferior temporal gyri are going to serve language and semantic memory processing, visual perception, and multimodal sensory integration. Here at number 13, we have the inferior frontal gyrus. This is associated with various cognitive functions, including attention, motor inhibition, and imagery, as well as social cognitive processes and speech functions. At number 22, we have the supramarginal gyrus. The supramarginal gyrus is activated for phonological processing during both language and verbal working memory tasks. Most of the cranial nerves can be seen with the inferior view of the brain. So here we have cranial nerve 1. Cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve. The cranial nerve allows for olfactory information to enter the brain. At number 2 here, we have the optic nerve. So cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve. Cranial nerve number 3 is the oculomotor nerve, and I can only see that when I take the brain apart. Okay, it's rubbed off on this one, but it's supposed to be right here. Okay, so that's cranial nerve number 3, which is the oculomotor nerve. Okay, so here's a better view that's close up. So here is cranial nerve number 1, which is the olfactory nerve. And here is cranial nerve 2, which is the optic nerve. Cranial nerve number 3 is more interior and can't be viewed from this angle. Cranial nerve number 4 is located here, right there, and this is the trochlear nerve. Cranial nerve number 5 is the trigeminal nerve. Cranial nerve number 6 is the abducens nerve. Cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve. Cranial nerve 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. Cranial nerve number 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Cranial nerve 10 is the vagus nerve. Cranial nerve number 11 is the spinal accessory nerve. And finally, cranial nerve 12 is the hypoglossal nerve. The brainstem includes all of these structures here. The brainstem is actually separated into 3 regions. The region here, which has the deeper structures, is called the midbrain, sometimes also called the mesencephalon. So this region is the mesencephalon or the midbrain. You might see here where I have this lump or this bulge here. This portion of the brainstem is called the pons. The pons. Inferior to the pons, I have the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata. So here is the medial view of the brain, and let's look at those structures of the brainstem from this view. So here where I have this bulge, this is the pons. The pons is responsible for unconscious processes such as your sleep-wake cycle and your breathing. We have the medulla oblongata. This controls processes like your heartbeat, your breathing rate, and your blood pressure. One of the things I want to mention are the ventricles of the brain. So the ventricles of the brain, we have the lateral ventricles, which basically take the place of the first and second ventricles. And then we have the third, and then finally the fourth ventricle. So the ventricles are going to function to house cerebrospinal fluid, which is going to be continuously perfusing through the brain. So let me show you where those structures are in the brain. If I point to 82 in this particular model, and I ask you for the structure, I'm going to want the answer of the septum pellucidum. The septum pellucidum is actually the membrane that divides the right and left lateral ventricles from one another. Now, if I point here and I say name the ventricle that is located here, what I'm looking for is lateral ventricle. So this is where the lateral ventricle would be. The right and left would be separated by the septum pellucidum. Here at number 40, if I'm asking for the ventricle and I point here, I'm looking for the third ventricle. The third ventricle. The third ventricle also has this blue structure at number 84. This is the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. Choroid plexus of the third ventricle. This has ependymal cells, which are going to be continuously creating and secreting and replacing cerebrospinal fluid. The third ventricle connects to the fourth ventricle located here through this structure here. This is the cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct. The fourth and final ventricle in the brain is located here in between the brainstem and the cerebellum. One of the things I want to mention that we can see in this view, when the cerebellum is open like this, I see these very particular branch-like structures here in white. These structures are called the arbor vitae of the cerebellum. The arbor vitae of the cerebellum. Arbor meaning tree, so these are tree branches. At number 34, this entire structure here is called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is going to connect the right and left hemispheres to one another, allowing them to communicate with one another. The corpus callosum. This structure here is called the fornix. The fornix. The fornix is a bundle of white matter that connects the hippocampus to several subcortical brain regions and is pivotal for episodic memory. If you lose the function of your hippocampus, you're not able to form new memories. All right, so that is the fornix. The hippocampus is not seen in this model, but the hippocampus is the structure that is responsible for creating new episodic memories. I'm going to look at this other half of the brain because the numbers are different on either side. We have a structure here at number 29 called the cuneus. The cuneus is a Latin term for the word wedge. So this is named after its appearance. The cuneus is this wedge-shaped cortical area that is in the medial occipital gyri, superior to the calcarean fissure and posterior to the parietal occipital fissure. So it's this wedge-like structure here called the cuneus, and it's an important landmark. Here at number 26, we have a structure called the cingulate gyrus. The cingulate gyrus, the cingulate nucleus, is a component of the limbic system. The limbic system is where our emotional centers and addiction centers are housed. The cingulate nucleus is involved in processing emotions and regulating behavior. Here at number 28, we have the precuneus. The precuneus is a brain region involved in a variety of complex functions, which include memory recall, integration of information, mental imagery, and episodic memory retrieval. It's also responsive to pain. Here at number 27, we have the paracentral lobule. The paracentral lobule is this U-shaped structure that loops between the medial part of the central sulcus, and you can see that here. Here's that central sulcus at number 4. And this includes the anterior portion of the motor area and the posterior portion of the sensory area for the lower limbs. This is the location of the pineal gland, sometimes called the pineal gland or pineal body or pineal body. The function of this area is when we are exposed to darkness, this area will begin to secrete melatonin to allow us to sleep. This is one of the reasons why they say to stay away from blue light within an hour before you're trying to go to sleep, because blue light can activate this area and cause this not to secrete melatonin, making it more difficult to fall asleep. So the pineal gland. So this is in charge of your sleep-wake cycle by secreting the hormone melatonin. Here I have a structure called the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is at the end of a stalk that lies at the very inferior portion of the cerebrum. You might recall that the pituitary gland is actually housed in the skull in the sella turcica of the sphenoid. The pituitary gland is sometimes referred to as the master gland. This is because it secretes hormones that play roles in growth, sexual reproduction, development, and it secretes hormones that control other glands, such as the thyroid gland, adrenal gland, and the gonads. This is the pituitary gland. Highlighted in yellow, we see the anterior and posterior commissures. The anterior and posterior commissures. And I have these on both sides. In this half, it would be the anterior and posterior commissure. The anterior commissure interconnects the amygdala of the temporal lobe. The amygdala is part of your limbic system and has to do with emotions. So the anterior commissure is going to interconnect the amygdala and the temporal lobes, contributing to the roles of memory, emotion, speech, hearing, olfaction, instinct, and sexual behaviors. At 41, we have the posterior commissure, and this is important in language processing. This connects the language processing centers of the brain in both hemispheres. But keep in mind that the reading and writing of language is very localized in the left hemisphere only. However, in the right hemisphere, we do have language comprehension, and we can respond with the right brain with drawings instead of with words. Going back to this side, because it is better represented here. Here at number 42, I have a structure that actually has two parts. All right, so here at 42, this is sometimes referred to as the tectum or the tectal plate, or the corpora quadrigemina. For my exams, I would prefer if you separate this structure into the two main components, which are the superior colliculus, which be located here at this superior bump, and it's very small here. So this superior bump, and here on the side, it actually denotes one versus the other. So the top portion of this is going to be the superior colliculus. The bottom portion is the inferior colliculus. And the reason why I want you to make that distinction instead of just simply saying the tectum or corpora quadrigemina is because they have two different functions that I think are both very interesting. The superior colliculus is a reflexive center that is going to orient the head and eyes towards any sudden change in light stimulus, such as maybe a dark looming shadow in your peripheral vision or a bright flash of light. The inferior portion is the inferior colliculus. This is your reflexive center that orients your head and eyes toward sudden changes in auditory stimuli, such as a loud sound or a boom. So there should be a number 3 right here. This is where the cranial nerve 3 or the oculomotor nerve sits. The oculomotor nerve helps to adjust and coordinate the eye positioning during movement. For example, you could be running on a treadmill and actually be reading a book. Without this structure here, the oculomotor nerve, this would be an extremely difficult task to do. In this model, if I point here and I ask for the ventricle, I'm looking for third ventricle. If I'm pointing here and I ask for the structure at number 40, I'm asking for the interthalamic adhesion. The interthalamic adhesion forms a bridge of tissue connecting the thalamus of each hemisphere across the midline of the brain. So here at 46, this is the thalamus. So the thalamus is the sensory relay center for the brain. All of the senses are going to go through the thalamus before they go up to higher regions of the brain. All of them except for the sense of smell. Your sense of olfaction is actually the only sense that's not going to go through the thalamus. Below the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus, which would lie around here. The hypothalamus is going to receive chemical messages from nerve cells in the brain and nerves from the body that are going to give the brain information here at the hypothalamus about its internal functioning. If something is out of balance, like ionic state, blood pressure, osmotic balance, temperature, if something is out of balance, then the hypothalamus is going to try to put this right and maintain homeostasis. The hypothalamus is going to produce hormones that control things like the body temperature, heart rate, hunger, mood, sex drive, sleep, thirst, and also releases hormones that are going to cause other glands, such as the pituitary gland, to secrete their hormones in a cascade of events. So let's go ahead and zoom out a little bit and recap. Here is the paracentral lobule, the precuneus, the cingulate gyrus, the cuneus, the corpus callosum, the lateral ventricle, the fornix, the third ventricle, the choroid plexus of the third ventricle, the cerebral aqueduct, the fourth ventricle. The structure at number 40 is the interthalamic adhesion. Here I have the thalamus, the hypothalamus. I've got the pineal gland or pineal gland. I've got the anterior commissure and the posterior commissure. I've got the tectal plate or tectum or corpora quadrigemina. The superior portion is the superior colliculus. The inferior portion is the inferior colliculus. Here's the pituitary gland, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. All right, looking at the structures we can see on this side, we have the corpus callosum. If I point here and ask for the structure, I'm looking for the septum pellucidum, which is the membrane that separates the right and left lateral ventricles from one another. If I point here and ask for the ventricle, please put lateral ventricle. Here is the third ventricle. This is the choroid plexus of the third ventricle, the cerebral aqueduct, and the fourth ventricle. The structure located in number 40 is the interthalamic adhesion. Above this would be the location of the thalamus. Below the interthalamic adhesion would be the location of the hypothalamus. This structure here is the fornix. The fornix. Here is the anterior commissure, and this would be the posterior commissure. This structure here is the pons, and this is the medulla oblongata. This is a cross-section of the cerebellum. These tree-like branches of the cerebellum are called the arbor vitae of the cerebellum. On this side, it looks a little bit different because we have the cerebellum still intact. The pineal gland would be here, pineal gland. Below the posterior commissure is where I would have the tectal plate or corpora quadrigemina, which has the superior colliculus and inferior colliculus, which would be in this area. The anterior portion is here. Here is the central sulcus. Central sulcus. Here is the primary motor cortex, the primary somatosensory cortex. From here to here would be frontal lobe. From here to there, or there, yeah. So below 19. So that would be the parietal lobe. Okay, the parietal lobe. From there to where 19 is right here. And what you want to look for is 8. 8 goes up here. So this is going to be the border of where the occipital lobe is. Okay, so that would be occipital lobe from here on. All right, let's go ahead and flip this around a little bit, get a better view of the occipital lobe and structures here in the back. So occipital lobe. All right, this is the cerebellum. This is the medulla oblongata. Okay, this is the great longitudinal fissure. Great longitudinal fissure. The Sylvian fissure. This is the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe. Side view of the cerebellum. Midbrain or mesencephalon. The pons. Medulla oblongata. Pituitary gland. So this is the temporal lobe, making this the superior temporal gyrus, medial temporal gyrus, and inferior temporal gyrus. 11 is the superior frontal gyrus. 12 is the middle frontal gyrus, and 13 would be the inferior frontal gyrus. We have the supramarginal gyrus located at number 22. Posterior to this, at number 21, we have the angular gyrus. At 17, we have the intraparietal sulcus. Here at number 18 in this model, we have the superior parietal lobule.